So, how would one go about, learning to be a good co host? What are some of the important, things to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I have a few for learning how to be a good co-host. And these are like principles that I have in place it's for my own sort of memory, I guess. Anytime I get on a show, I'm like, these are the bullet points that I like to remember of what I'm trying to accomplish, right? How I'm trying to accomplish this. So the first one I call, you got to learn how to be ignorant and curious,
Mm.
right? And so ignorant and curious means that, despite whatever position you are in life, right? So like, I'm at this point in time when we're recording this, I'm 38 years old. I've run several businesses. I've traveled the world. I've got all sorts of experiences. There's not a lot of topics that I'm ignorant about. But
Right.
when I'm getting on the phone with someone who is an expert in their own right, I'm going to take a position of ignorance. And the position of ignorance is not it's an important distinction. It's not an admission of me being stupid or of being dumb or not knowing something. It is an admission that what my goal is to make really good content for our audience and to
Right.
make my guests look really good. Welcome to PvP.fm, brought to you by Pushbutton Podcasts, your go-to resource for grabbing attention, building awareness, and creating authority in your marketplace. I'm Richard Matthews, your host and guide through the wonderful world of podcasting as a driver of business. Here, we teach how to use a multimedia podcast as the cornerstone of your omnipresent content marketing strategy. Whether you're an entrepreneur, podcaster, expert, or thought leader, you'll discover creative ways to leverage your digital content. From blogs to video, from YouTube to TikTok, and everything in between. I'll show you how to stand out from the noise so you can directly connect with potential customers, build strategic partnerships, and drive leads into your business. Get ready for actionable tips and tangible takeaways on improving your digital presence across the board. With that, let's dive into this week's episode of PvP.fm. So hello and welcome back to the PvP.fm podcast. I have a brand new person to introduce to you guys here on the show. Her name is Brandi Spaich. Brandi, are you there?
Yes, sir. I'm right here.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. Brandi is some of the newest talent over at Pushbutton Podcasts, and she is coming on board with us today because she's going to be taking over the host position for the PvP.fm podcast. So why don't you take just a couple of seconds, Brandi, and tell us a little bit about yourself so our audience can get to know you a little bit as we dive into this new chapter.
Yeah. So, my name is Brandi Spaich. I am 19 years old. I'll be 20 pretty soon. I think I've been working behind the scenes in the post production side of Push Button Podcast for about a year now, I believe. So, I like to be in front of a camera. So, I'm super excited to do stuff like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Brandy's one of our social media experts on the backside of Push Button Podcast. So she's volunteered to come in and start talking with you guys, our audience, and with our team members and with our clients to really take what we're doing here on this podcast to the next level. So over the course of the next few weeks and months, you'll see Brandy coming on with me. You'll see Brandy coming on with some of our team members. You'll probably see Brandy come on by herself and talk about maybe gear reviews, other things. We're going to do a whole bunch of cool stuff with the podcast going forward. So I don't know. Are you excited about putting some of this content together?
Oh, for sure. Honestly, I've wanted to make content in general since I was little. So, this is
Dream come
100% I'm
true.
excited for it.
Awesome. So this episode is going to be a bit crazy because what we're going to attempt to do is we're going to talk through the 10th commandment of podcasting, which if you've been following along with our series, I don't know if we've covered all of them yet, but the 10th commandment of podcasting is thou shalt learn to give good interview. Right. And so learning to give good interview is all about learning how to be a good host or co-host on a show so that you can really create good content in your marketplace. And so we're going to talk through this together where I'm going to let Brandy be the host of the show and ask me the questions about how to be a good co-host. So it's going to be kind of very meta as we're going to go back and forth on that. So you can see a little bit of like the training process that would go into being a good host for your show. And if you are running a show yourself, right? If you're listening to this and you're building your own podcast, learning this skill I think is going to be really useful. So we're going to go through and run through this process as if Brandy was the host of this show all the way through. And so we'll see how that goes. It's a little bit of an experimental thing. But Brandy, I'll let you take it over from here. Let's see how it goes.
All right. So ultimately, today we're talking about, learning how to be a good host slash co-host on a podcast so that you can make sure that your guest is the star of the show and kind of learn how to make the interview process a deposit into a goodwill bank account with them. So, Richard, why is this topic so important to you and to learn in general?
So, I've done at this point roughly 400, 450 interviews where I've been either the host or I've been the guest on someone's podcast. And there's been a lot of things that have really come forth on like what makes a good podcast interview. And so there's a couple of things that I really like to talk about on why it's important. And so the first one is the purpose of running a podcast in the first place. You have to remember we're talking to businesses who are using a podcast, a video podcast as a way to drive revenue in their business, right? And there's a few different ways that they might
Mhm.
be driving revenue in their business. One of them could be from the actual content marketing that's going out and talking to their audience and building that know, like, and trust in the marketplace. And the other way is by interviewing specific people in their business that they either want to build strategic partnerships with or that they want to build to actually attract as a client themselves,
Mhm.
right? And so the podcast is a way, that interview, to build some of that business directly, right? So there's two things that are really good there. If you are interviewing a guest and that guest is a good strategic partner or a good potential client, you want the whole interview, the whole process of what you're doing with them to end up being valuable to them, right? Where they're like, oh man, she made me look great. He made me sound wonderful. He made my
Mhm.
business look good. He made for an engaging conversation that I know is going to be valuable in the marketplace. And so when you do that, when you show up as a good host or good co-host, it's like probably the best metaphor I've ever heard for it is in ballroom dancing, where they talk about the man is the picture frame that is showing off the woman, right?
Right.
And so your host co-host role when you're doing this, when you have a guest on, is you want to be the frame for the beautiful picture that is your guest and
Mhm.
their story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that when you put it like that too. So, like, is there any way that good interviewing can result in, some better business or better engagement, stuff along those lines?
Yeah, so on the better business side, the better job you do of being that picture frame, the
Mhm.
more the interview itself is going to be perceived as valuable to the guest that you had on, right? And then it
Mhm.
opens up a lot of opportunities for you in the future to build a business relationship with your guest. Now, the other
Right.
side of that is you're not building the podcast in a vacuum, right? You're going to put this
Mhm.
podcast out into the marketplace. And so by putting the podcast out into the marketplace, you have an audience who's going to be paying attention to that. And so
Right.
when you do a good job of being a co-host, you're going to, and we'll talk a little bit about how in the future,
Mhm.
how you're going to get into this, but there's going to be a portion of mutual exchange of stories and other things where you're going to be talking back and forth, and some of your expertise is going to get to be shown and the guest expertise is going to be shown. I like to talk in terms of your domains of mastery, like where they overlap. And so that sort of gets put to the forefront. And the podcast interview itself is going to be engaging and fun for your listeners who are paying attention, right? They're going to
Right.
learn things, and they're going to learn things because of the way that you conduct the interview as the host. And so you get sort of both sides of that benefit of being a good host. You're going to create value with your guest that can
Mhm.
turn into business, and you're going to create value in the marketplace with the actual content that you're producing. Does that make
Right.
sense? So you get more
Yeah.
engaged viewers and more business.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Is there any like upsides to learning it now versus in the future? Like, why would people want to learn all of that stuff now?
Learning to be so, like, being good as a host is not a skill that is just going to be something you can turn on, right? It's
Mhm.
not something you can just learn overnight. It's gonna
Mhm.
be something that you're going to have to put in the reps, right? The more episodes you do, the more interviews you do, the better you'll be at being a co-host on a show, right? Or
Right.
the host of your own show. And that process is going to take time.
Mhm.
And so learning and starting now means that you shorten the time to getting the better results out of it, right? And so,
Right.
and it's not a zero sum game either, right? If you get on your first one and you're not that great as a host, it's not the end of your podcast. It's not the end of your business. It's not the end of the relationship with the people that you had. It's not like if you show up and try, you're not going to butcher it so badly that like you'll never have business with that person
Right.
again. Right.
Yeah.
If you just show up and you follow some of the things we're going to talk about in a minute on the how, you will do a good job. And
Mhm.
as you do a good job, over time, you'll start to get to a point where you're really, really great at it. And when you're really great at it, you start to hear that from your guests. But people will be like, wow,
Right.
that was a really great interview. I really enjoyed talking to you. I enjoyed the questions that you asked. All right, and you start to get that feedback going. And
Mhm.
so the more reps you can get in, the earlier you can start doing that, the faster you get to that. I'm a great host, co-host for a show.
Right. Kind of that thing of, you can't get better if you don't practice. So you got to start somewhere and you're only going to go up from wherever you started from.
Absolutely.
So how would one go about, learning to be a good co-host? What are some of the important things to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I have a few for learning how to be a good co-host, and these are like principles that I have in place for. It's for my own sort of memory, I guess. Anytime I get on a show, I'm like, these are the bullet points that I like to remember of what I'm trying to accomplish, right? How I'm trying to accomplish this. So the first one I call you got to be learn how to be ignorant and curious,
Mhm.
right? And so ignorant and curious means that despite whatever position you are in life, right? So like, I'm at this point in time when we're recording this, I'm 38 years old. I've run several businesses. I've traveled the world. I've got all sorts of experiences. There's not a lot of topics that I'm ignorant
Mhm.
about. But
Right.
when I'm getting on the phone with someone who is an expert in their own right, I'm
Mhm.
going to take a position of ignorance. And the position of ignorance is not and it's an important distinction. It's not an admission of me being stupid or of
Mhm.
being dumb or not knowing something. It is an admission that what my goal is to make really good content for our audience and to
Right.
make my guest look really good.
Mhm.
And so the best way to do that is to take a position of ignorance where I want anyone who's in my audience to be able to get really good value out of the interview. So I want to
Mhm.
make sure that I'm looking at the things that you're saying and looking at the
Right.
things that you are talking about and asking the questions that I wish someone would ask if,
Mhm.
if I was sitting in the room, if we were actually
Right.
sitting around a campfire together and you said something that was interesting. And as a co-host, if you miss that opportunity, me and the audience is going to be like, oh man, I wish they would have asked this question. You want
Mhm.
to play that ignorant role. So you're seeing those opportunities to ask good questions.
Right.
And that's where the curiosity comes in, right? It's like, I don't know what you know. I don't, even if we have the same sort of level of expertise in a topic, you have a different set of experiences and
Mhm.
perspective and like life story that goes behind that. I want to pull out. And that's where that ignorant and curious section or like principle really comes into play.
Mhm.
And so learning how to be ignorant and curious about a topic is going
Right.
to give you the fodder to ask really good questions and to be a
Mhm.
good interviewer.
Right. I'm glad explain the ignorant part very well because I know a lot of people have a very negative connotation of that word when all it means really is you don't know about a topic. So I do want to go back to something you had said. You had mentioned kind of exchanging stories. I don't know if you wanted to elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah. So the second sort of principle that I cover when trying to be a good interview is I call it the mutual exchange of stories.
Mhm.
And so the mutual exchange of stories is this idea that I've had this experience on podcasts before where you get on with a co-host and they'll be like, they have their list of questions, right?
Right.
And they got like 10 questions and they'll just ask the question and you answer the question and they go, "Sweet." Right?
Yeah.
You click, way to answer that question. And then they just ask the next question.
Mhm.
And there's no interaction, right? It's not an
Right.
actual human interaction.
Mhm.
And the way humans interact, the way that people interact, is that we share stories with one another.
Mhm.
And so the baseline for this is an understanding of how human nature works. And
Right.
so where that comes in is humans are what I call a story-born people. And what that means is we define our relationships
Mhm.
based on how much of the other person's story that we know. So, and you can see that
Right.
reflected in our language. So if you
Mhm.
look into our language, we have words like stranger, right? A
Mhm.
stranger is someone that you don't know their name and you don't know
Mhm.
their story, right? That's what they
Right.
are, is a
Mhm.
stranger. We have another word, acquaintance. Acquaintance means that you know their name, but you don't know their story, right? And then a friend might be someone who you know their name and you know some of their story. And a best friend is someone that you know their name and you know so many of their stories that the only way that you get to know them better is by going out and having new experiences and sharing those stories with one another.
Right.
Right.
Mhm.
And so that's how we define our relationships. So, as a co host or a host of a show, what you're trying to do for your audience is allow your audience to get to know the both of you, right? To
Right.
see a human relationship being developed. And so that human relationship being developed requires that you have both of those parts where you ask a question and get a story or get information from
Mhm.
them. And then in response, you have a story or example or something to share in return, an experience or something that helps. And then you get that benefit of a real conversation that's interesting to
Mhm.
people. And it's one of the things I see most hosts make the biggest mistakes on
Mhm.
because they will take the assumption that what I'm supposed to do as a host is to let the other person talk 100% of the time and me only talk a
Right.
little bit of the time, when really what you wanna do is you wanna talk back and forth.
It kind of reminds me of, like, a news interview versus, say, like, a talk show. The news ones, they always feel, I don't know, almost robotic. That's not how humans speak to each other. Whereas the talk shows, they're typically, like you said, exchanging those stories relating to each other. So I feel like I don't know. I hope that's a good example to maybe some people that would watch more of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I think
Alright.
you're right too, because like
Yeah.
you ever see like the news anchors who are like they'll hold the thing up, be like, ask a question and they let the person answer and they're like, and then they
Mhm.
ask another question, let the other person answer, and it's
Yeah.
like there's no like interaction happening. Not like
No.
it's not an authentic one anyways.
Mhm.
Whereas when you get onto the talk shows or hopefully when you get onto a podcast like this,
Right.
you're seeing two people actually interact with each other.
Mhm.
And so the way I like to look at it, like the metaphor I use for it is a fireside chat, where it's like
Right.
you and I are sitting around a fire ring at the campground, chatting with each other about, in this case, the topic of how to be a good co-host. And our
Right.
audience is all the people that are sitting around the fire ring with us, right? They're all the ones that are listening to us talk. And if we're doing a good job of exchanging stories, they're leaning in over the fire ring, right? And
Mhm.
they're trying to
Right.
listen more because we're having a good, interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Are you ready to amplify your influence and stand out from the noise? Join Richard Matthews on pbp.fm as he explores the power of podcasting, social media, and strategic content to boost your reach. You'll discover the latest trends in video, audio, and influencer marketing, plus unlock insider tips to create binge-worthy content spotlighting you as a leader. With upbeat energy and clear, empowering advice, Richard guides publishers, experts, and entrepreneurs on starting a podcast, improving social strategy, and connecting with your perfect audience. Visit pbp.fm and book a podcast strategy session to start spreading your message today.
So I know, and it's a good point, just because it's something I struggle with when looking for, opportunities to add or like clarify something or ask a question. How do you go about finding exactly when to interject without interrupting?
So this is probably one of the hardest things to do. And I do this co-hosting thing all the time. We've got a few podcasts that we run on interviewing people regularly. You have to learn how to control the pace of the conversation.
Right.
And you control the pace of the conversation by looking for opportunities like lulls in their speech to interject. And sometimes you'll have a guest on and they'll just talk forever. And you have to, in order for the content to be good, you can't just be like, okay, you need to shut up now and let me talk.
Yeah.
So what you're looking for is you're looking for those lulls in the opportunity, and you're looking for opportunities to add clarity, add value.
Mhm.
So there's a couple of key things that pop out to me for that. One of them is if someone uses jargon,
Mhm.
right? If they use jargon that's specific to their industry or something like that, it's like always a
Right.
good time to be like, so I noticed when you were saying XYZ, you talked about, you use this word. And I
Mhm.
know not everyone who is in this world might know that word, right?
Mhm.
Because you're the expert here. So can you talk a little about what that word means, how you use it,
Mhm.
those kind of things? So you can definitionally, that's a really good one to use. And then one of the other ones would be when someone finishes their story, whatever they're talking about, is to use that as an opportunity to a further question. Right. So you can
Right.
either ask a further question or to respond with a story yourself. Be like, oh, that was really interesting. Can you expand more on this point? You said this thing
Mhm.
and I thought that was cool. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, why do you think
Right.
that's cool? Or what's the thing that you're looking for there? Which I think actually brings me to my last sort of point here is
Mhm.
understanding a structure you can always use to dive into more details. And
Right.
it's something you've seen probably on every one of our podcasts. And we went through
Yes.
this a few episodes ago, which you weren't here on that for, but we talked
I
about
was.
how to build the structure. And the structure we
Mhm.
follow on our podcast is what, why, how, now, right? Here's what we're talking about. Here's why it's important. Here's how you can do it. Here's, my a story and perspective and stuff on it. And what's cool is that's a macro structure, but it's also a
Mhm.
micro structure. And so a micro structure, meaning you can hold that in your head at any given time.
Mhm.
And when someone says something that you want to find more details about, that you want to dive
Right.
into, instead of trying to figure out, okay, how do I dive more into that? You can just follow the microstructure. Tell me
Mhm.
a little bit more about that. That's the what, right? Why is
Right.
that an important thing to you? Right?
Mhm.
That's the why, right? Tell me a little bit more about how that impacts your business or how that impacts
Mhm.
your whatever, right? Do you have a story that goes along with that? Right?
Right.
Something like that. So you can use that microstructure to really dive into something that you think would be
Mhm.
interesting to the audience.
Right. And it's a great way to do that because it's very important, especially when you're on something that's more on the spot rather than a full script like you would in maybe a YouTube video or something along those lines, to be able to have something short and easy to remember in order to, pick up the conversation, or if you're getting a little lost, so you can use that to get back on track. I know you mentioned the now at the end of that. What would that consist of? You know?
So your now, the now, which is the last part of, the major part of your interview, is there's a few pieces to it. So the first piece of your now is the perspective. And so perspective is the perspective of, in this case, your guest, right? And so in
Right.
my case, I've done a lot of interviews, I've done this a lot. And
Mhm.
so my perspective that I want to share on it is like, that's sort of, it's the examples that we've been going over the whole time. And so you might be looking for a story or something, a story prompt that you can pull
Mhm.
out of them. Like, hey, can you tell me a story about when you used this? And I
Right.
say there's three different ways you can share perspective. So there's
Mhm.
stories, and what a story is, it's an emotionally driven narrative. Right.
Mhm.
So, before Brandy knew how to use the what, why, how, now structure, she was nervous and she didn't know how to be a good co host. And after she knew the what, why, how, now structure, she was confident and, happy and bubbly, right? Like whatever.
Right.
It's emotionally driven story. A
Mhm.
case study would be the same type of narrative structure, except you're emphasizing data rather than
Mhm.
emotions. So it'd be like, on Brandy's episodes before she learned the what, why, how, now structure, her average engagement was, 10%. And after
Right.
she learned the what, why, how, now structure, her average engagement was 30%, right? And it's
Mhm.
data driven narrative.
Right.
And so that helps to drive perspective home on whatever you're talking about, right? So that's what that
Mhm.
now is, learning how to drive the points home. And you can drive
Right.
the points home emotionally, you can drive the points home with data, or you can drive the points home with examples. And so
Mhm.
examples, the last one. And so the example might be, right, like that's what we've been doing this whole time, is like giving
Yeah.
little examples.
Mhm.
And so if you were doing something like really, off the wall or something, like, let's say it was, you were doing a podcast about how to do a good Facebook ad, right? You might
Right.
have examples like, this is a bad Facebook ad and this is a good
Mhm.
Facebook ad. Or I know you guys have horses. You'd be like, this is,
Yes.
the farrier did a good job on the horseshoes and the farrier did a bad job on the horseshoes. Like, this is what you would look
Right.
for, right?
Kinda that
And
comparison almost.
yeah, so the examples are a great way to really drive a point home. So if you've been talking the whole time about like how to hire a farrier, right?
Mhm.
And I know nothing about hiring a farrier, so I'm literally pulling this all out of my butt. But
Yep.
the
You
idea would be like, here's how you hire a farrier, and here's like, if you can see examples of their work, this is what you're looking for, that kind
Mhm.
of stuff. Right. So that's where that now fits in, is looking
Right.
to get those stories. And you can sometimes, depending on what you're talking about with someone, you might have all three of those things. You're
Mhm.
like, "Hey, can you tell a story about some time when you hired a bad farrier and what happened with the horse and how that was, caused damage," something like that. And, can you show some examples of what they look like, those kind of things. And so that now
Mhm.
section, that first one, is the perspective. And then the
Mhm.
second part, so you got perspective is the first part of now. And then
Mhm.
the second part, so I like, probably this is important to note. I like to think of now as, now that you know what you know, right? Now that
Right.
you've listened to us, what else should you do? Right. And
Right.
so that's where you can share your perspective, and that's where you can share I call it your call to adventure. And you asked me an important question earlier. What's the difference between a call to
Yes.
adventure and a call to action? And there's not really. I just think call to action is boring and call to adventure is more fun.
I absolutely
So
agree. Sounds so much more fun.
yeah. And for our purposes here, we're talking about stories. And
Mhm.
so if you're talking about like hero's journey and things like that, there's always a call to adventure, which is something that is drawing your protagonist in. Right. And that's
Right.
really what you're doing, is you're trying to draw your audience further into your world. And so
Mhm.
I think it's more poignant and it's more accurate to what you're actually trying to do than just saying call to action. So I always like call to adventure. What's the adventure that you just took them on? And then what are the next steps of that adventure? And so the
Right.
metaphor I always like to use is your podcast interview, or whatever it
Mhm.
is you were doing. But in our case, it's the
Mhm.
podcast interview, was a journey that you just took the audience on. Right. And so if we took them on this journey, you're going to leave them, right? Like the tour guide at the end of the journey, be like, okay, you're here. We took you from, let's say you were going from, the journey was from Los Angeles to New York, and you did the podcast interview. You only made it to Las Vegas. Right.
Right.
Now at Las Vegas, you're like, hey, this is where our adventure stops. But if you want to continue,
Mhm.
right, you have your call to
The
adventure. So
book
there's
is that
two,
way.
yeah, there's two types of call to adventure. There's the soft call to adventure. The
Mhm.
soft call to adventure is like, hey, we're going to continue this journey next week. Every
Mhm.
Thursday, we put out a new episode, right? Whatever it is. And, next week we're going to take you on the journey from Las Vegas to St. George, Utah. Right.
Mhm.
That's what we're going to do. That's a soft call to adventure. Make sure you subscribe. Right. And
Right.
it's, so that soft call to adventure is, I call it, technically it's an on platform action. Right.
Mhm.
If you're on Apple Podcasts, the action is hit the subscribe button. If they're on YouTube, it's hit the
Right.
subscribe button, turn on notification bell, right? If they're on Facebook, it's like the page,
Mhm.
right? Whatever the thing is, it's an on-platform action that allows them to join you for the next stage of the journey,
Right.
right? Whatever the next thing is. And then you have your hard call to action. Your hard call to action is an off-platform action, right? It's an off-platform thing that they can do.
Mhm.
And so what you're looking for there is you're looking for, okay, we just learned something here, right? In this case, in the case of our episode, you learned how to be a good co-host or host for your show, right? And so if you have a resource, if you have a discovery session, if you have a lead magnet is a pretty common term in the industry, if you have
Mhm.
a book, if you have a course, if you have something in your business, a SKU of some sort, whether it's free or paid, that you can send someone to take it to the next level, right? How do
Right.
they get more on this topic? You can
Mhm.
have a hard call to adventure. So soft call to adventure, every one of your episodes should have built in.
Right.
Hard call to adventure, when it makes sense, when you have something that ties in with it, you can
Mhm.
send someone to go further into your journey. So those are your now part of being a good co-host is
Mhm.
learning how to both have like what those call to adventures are and then learning to integrate them into your interviews. So this one is a little bit difficult because the way, I'm teaching
Right.
how to do this while you would be the one doing this. So that what I might do is as the co-host, right? If you were co-hosting this
Mhm.
show, you might start with, if they have a hard call to adventure, is like, hey, if you really liked this topic, I
Mhm.
know that Richard has XYZ. Richard,
Right.
why don't you tell us a little bit about what that is and where they can go to get it? Right. And
Yeah.
so you have that hard call to adventure to send them off. And then you can take over and do the soft call to adventure yourself.
Mhm.
Right. And so for this episode, we don't actually have a hard call to adventure because there's not like
Yes.
a resource about how to be a good co host. Maybe eventually we'll put one together. So we don't have that. But why don't you go ahead and take over and do our soft call to adventure for this episode?
Yeah, so I mean that's the 10th commandment of podcasting. I'm sure if we've got the 10th, we've got the other 9 somewhere along the lines. So if you want to, make sure that you are able to do some good podcasting or you just want to learn how all that behind the scenes works and everything, just, make sure to like, subscribe, follow whatever platform you're on, notifications, all of that good stuff and check in the next time.
Awesome. Thank you for having us on again. You will see more of Brandi as we go forward. She's going to be doing more of the co-hosting, and we have more topics coming up on
Mhm.
that. So this is our 10th commandment of podcasting, and we're going to move on to some other series, I believe. We're going to do some of the most frequently asked questions that people ask
Mhm.
us about building a podcast. I think we're going to do
Right.
some questions you should be asking about your podcast and how you can turn
Mhm.
them in. We're going to be doing some series on myths and truths about podcasts. We got a whole bunch of stuff coming up for the show. And again, the goal for all of this is just to help you as a fellow business person learn how to use a podcast as the cornerstone of all your content marketing. So Brandi, thanks for coming on today
Of
and
course. Thank
running
you.
our first co-host thing. I know this one was a little bit weird
Yes.
because we're trying
It
to.
was. It definitely was. It was a little strange, I've got my list of topics, and I'm like, yeah, but I need to learn these topics first. So it's very meta, but I enjoyed it. I hope that all of the viewers enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it as well. I promise I will be practicing this quite a lot to be a lot smoother at going through all that stuff. I know it was probably a bit choppy.
No, I think we did a good job today. So, that's it for today. We'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for being on here today, Brandi.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on pbp.fm. Make sure to visit our website, pbp.fm, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via RSS so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. And if you'd like to get help building an omnipresent content marketing strategy with a podcast and you want help, you might want to book a podcast strategy session with us at pbp.fm. Just click the Book a Strategy Session button and book a time on our calendar. We look forward to speaking with you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.